welcome to Storiography, a storytelling and history podcast. We're your hosts, Greg and Noah, and this is a podcast where we talk about fiction, history, and the media where the two meet. Today, we're talking about Sharpe's Eagle by Bernard Cornwell.
So each episode, we'll be picking a piece of media that tells a historical or history-inspired narrative. And we'll be having a conversation about how that media presents its historical media and story. We're less interested in strict historical accuracy than we are in the art of storytelling itself, and how that art interacts with the historical influences, settings, and ideas. We're casting a pretty wide net here, so our media selections will run the historical gamut, from television shows and movies to classical literature and video games. So, Greg, how about you tell us a little bit about the background of this novel, its publishing history, and a little bit about the author?
The background to this book, simply put, is that this was Bernard Cornwell, now a pretty well-known writer of historical adventure fiction. This was his first novel. In fact, he wrote it entirely as far as I'm aware, has always quite frankly admitted, basically because he needed an income. At the time, he'd just, if I recall correctly, finished a period of studying in the United States. He'd finished his period of study. He'd met a woman who he was courting and would later marry, and he needed some sort of source of income and demonstrable source of income to stay in the U.S. and move towards citizenship, or at least get his residency renewed.
Clearly, he hadn't discovered the L. Ron Hubbard school of making money off your books yet.
Well, actually, depending on where that joke was going, he was raised in a cult. So that joke is actually disturbingly on the nose. My understanding is that he was raised in a sort of weird cult in rural England. It doesn't really come up in this book, but he has a very, very negative view of religion. And it comes up in a number of other Sharpe books. So, not relevant to this one, but for a joke, that was alarmingly on the nose.
That's hilarious. That was just a throwaway, but yeah, you never expect that.
No, you don't expect that. But anyway, so this book was published. It was his first novel. It was published in 1981 originally. So this is going on 45 years old, and obviously was the first Sharpe novel written, but is not the first Sharpe novel in chronological order. This is, I think, either third or fourth in chronological order, going off of the main series of novels set in the Napoleonic Wars. If you include the prequels, I think this is like sixth or seventh.
Yeah, let me just pull down my copy of the book. Yeah, it's like book 7.
Oh, does it actually have a... Yeah, there's too many.
There's way too many. Yeah, there's like 21 of them. It's insane.
Well, that is one of the numbers I said, so I'll call that a victory. Yeah, and after a certain point, they do all start to blend together, which is apparently a problem for Cornwell as well, because I do remember reading a rather funny interview with him where he was talking about the process that he went through when ITV was adapting the books into the show. And apparently there were like entire novels that he'd just forgotten what he wrote. The example that this was about was Sharpe's Gold, which they completely changed for the adaptation. And apparently he had to go back and read the novel and then was like, huh, I wonder why they changed everything.
So he's not one of those authors that gets super precious about the adaptation of their work.
No, I think his attitude to all of this was he wrote these books to make money, and it's a job, nothing to get to, no massive artistic calling or creed, just, I think the period's kind of cool. I'll write some novels. Simple as. So that's the general background.
Yeah, so This was my first time reading this book, and the first time was actually on audiobook, and that was at work. And I actually think that the audiobooks are pretty good. They've got a solid narrator. They can kind of convey the emotions of the story maybe a little bit better than just a flat reading of these kind of stories can. Cornwell's prose is really quite workmanlike. So the audiobooks really do increase that enjoyment. And the second time I just read it as just a reading, a physical copy, and it really doesn't stand up to scrutiny the second read. It's very much in genre. It's a adventure story. It's an adventure novel. It's within the adventure genre, and I think that both has some interesting historical implications, but also some places where that really lets it down. The kind of straightforward plot really gets emphasized on a second read. And I guess it's important to keep in mind that this isn't really a military drama, and it's not necessarily meant to be historically accurate.
Yeah, that's an important distinction I think we'll be revisiting a lot in this discussion.
Yeah, we'll be talking a lot about what the priorities of the story are, what the priorities of the genre are, and then generally working through the historical ideas as they're presented. But what I found was overall the plot's very heavily driven by Richard Sharpe as a character. And that causes some problems within the story because when we were talking about it, we really characterized this story as a the plot exists to be a main character delivery device.
This is accurate.
And really, Cornwell has some odd ideas about what life in the military during his period and what the function of an officer even is.
For reasons we'll get into later. Yeah.
But overall, what I really found is that at the end of the day, none of the characters around Sharpe really matter, and Sharpe himself never really gets the character development or the motivation he needs really to drive the story forward. Yeah, and at the same time, he's really just protected by the narrative and by the author. You could pretty much say he's plot armored. He's not prone to failure at all, and has some pretty unrealistic things happen to him within this story. But he's also very much in genre. Sharpe feels sort of like a James Bond kind of archetype. He's very much within that adventure novel spirit.
Yeah, very much focused on that one character who has lots of plot armor, an unrealistic level of success with women, and also is thrown into some very goofy plots. This is much less goofy than the average James Bond novel, but also more goofy than a lot of things in reality. So we'll get there.
Yeah. So that was my first and second read of the book, and this would be your second read. You read you read it a long time ago, but now it's been so long that it almost becomes your second read or your first reading of the book. So what do you think of it overall?
You know what? I think my thing would be as someone who has a lot of research interest in this period and who's read a fair bit. I think I had several impressions. One was as a book to just read, very easy, not a big issue, went really fast. Nothing I really got hung up on. So as a reading experience, it was quite fun. As a historical experience, like I have to say, I did feel kind of underwhelmed a lot of the time, which we will get to, but also occasionally surprised in that there's stuff that does show up in the book that I'm surprised Cornwell brings up, but that I often don't entirely know what he's doing with. But it's just kind of surprising to see it brought up. And you think, oh, clearly you did your research there. You're not really, saying anything huge about this particular thing, but yeah, you did run into this and threw it in. And it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. There are other things that are kind of sketchy, but again, we'll get there. That's hardly a ringing endorsement, but I enjoyed reading it, even while I was often sort of going, would have done it differently if I were doing this.
Yeah, really, one of the big issues with analyzing something like this is that we're practicing historians and we're going to say, oh, we want to do this a certain way, that detail's not correct. And we'll try to keep that down for this analysis, but it's going to come up.
Yeah, or into researching the minute details of the stuff that finds its way into the book. And that's okay. And part of it may also just be that this was written in 1981, because unsurprisingly, in the last 45 years, scholarship on the British Army and the Napoleonic period has changed a bit. So there may be some of that going on there as well. I know that there were certain tropes that came up in histories published in like the 60s and 70s that are pretty much fully debunked now, but that would have been quite, pretty much just tacitly accepted at the time by a lot of people, and that do show up in this book, which is interesting. And with that, shall we rotate into the novel?
Yeah, let's go for it.
So, for those who aren't familiar, pretty much all of the Sharpe novels are set during the Napoleonic Wars. Most of those, in turn, are set in the Peninsular War, which is the British Army's long-running commitment in Spain, fighting the French on behalf of an ingenuous alliance with the Spanish provisional government, which usually is referred to as the Spanish junta, which is essentially a military junta, but not in any sense a recognized or stable government. It is mostly composed of different military and some civil representatives who do what they want in different parts of the country and then make vague decisions, mostly without really a formal political apparatus to support them. So the results are very weird and complicated. And as you can imagine, being allied to that kind of a government gets very, very annoying very quickly. But tangent there aside, this particular novel, Sharpe's Eagle, is set in 1809, fairly early in the Peninsular War, during one of Wellington's first expeditions, the British Army under the Duke of Wellington's first expeditions into Spain from Portugal, a country which the British have a much better relationship with. And that leads up to the Battle of Talavera, which happens near the end of the book, shortly after which the campaign is called off due to various things going wrong that we'll talk about later. So it's set in a fairly small period of time, following Richard Sharpe, lieutenant at the start of the book, acting captain at the end of the book, in the 95th Rifles, which is very noticeably not, in fact, in the peninsula in strength at this time. So he gets into some really weird problems and then has to deal with them. The one isolated rifle company that Sharpe commands gets folded into another regiment. Hijinks ensue. The commanding officer of the regiment is a dingbat for various reasons, as are most of his officers, and by the end of the book has basically ruined his own reputation, but Sharpe, through various means, saves the regiment's reputation despite this. That's, I think, as much of a plot summary as anyone really needs to dive into this. Honestly, if you want more of a plot summary, you can go look it up. This book is 45 years old. This was published in 1981, which means that it is 2 years, I believe, 2 years older than The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah, I'm not really sure who the demographic listeners of this podcast are going to be, but for the boomers in the audience, yes, 1981 was almost 45 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, neither of us were alive then, so anyway, with that, where do you want to go now, Noah?
Yeah, I think we can start diving into our main talking points. We might as well start with our commentary on story structure, what the priorities of the narrative are, the central conflicts and tensions. And we've already gotten it a little bit into this with some of our analysis of the plot structure and
Yeah.
the genre, but it's very much a adventure novel. It has some of the issues that come along with adventure novels, and honestly, they're a genre that I'm not a big fan of myself.
Well, yeah, and I mean, we've sort of dissected that fairly well here. It is, in every way, an adventure fiction. It has the all of the classic tropes. It has the almost unbelievably evil and inept villains. The designated love interest with no personality, the very OP main character, the helpful sidekick characters that don't get fleshed out anywhere near as much as we'd like, and a plot that, to your point of view, has a certain amount of plot armor surrounding it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very much an adventure story, but in some ways it breaks with its own genre conventions and formatting in kind of odd ways. The story really starts in medias res. It starts right in the middle of the campaign. Sharpe has had several backstory things happen to him. He's been through the ringer recently, and the story really goes to great pains to detail this in the first little bit of the narrative. While most adventure stories tend to prefer starting off with a bit of a shotgun approach, this really takes the time to dump a lot of exposition on you. You get a general idea of Sharpe's background right from the start, what his deal is, some of the people around him, and it takes the first, I want to say, around 30 pages, and the plot doesn't really get started until after that, which is an odd structure, in my opinion. It sort of weakens the overall flow of the story.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure why Cornwell did it that way. I mean, largely because a lot of this you could really pick up in other ways. Like, it didn't have to be front loaded like this. And some of it isn't even relevant to this story. So it's very odd. It is a thing that he does continually in every novel. I will say that. There is always this substantial portion at the start of each novel of this is who Richard Sharpe is and what his backstory is in often quite a lot of detail. Now, the stuff that's happened recently obviously is more useful for context, but the general this is Sharpe and this is why Sharpe is an officer. Yeah, that's in pretty much every book. I mean, I know why, because the series was designed so that you can just pick up any book and just read it and not worry. But it is very curious. It has that same sort of weird vibe that like the original Blade Runner narration does, where it's like, why are you explaining this to me? I don't need an explanation of this.
Yeah, I think the other thing about the inherent structure of this story is just how closely it shackles itself to Sharpe's point of view. If he's not immediately there, present at the event doesn't really happen. So that the story kind of warps itself around him as the main character. And I know we'll talk a little bit later about other characters that maybe could have filled in a point of view role, but don't. My bigger issue is actually that Sharpe just doesn't have a whole lot of internality as a character. For the amount of time we spend in his shoes, his internal, we don't really get an idea of his internal frame of reference, or what we do get is really simple. I don't know, it's something that if you're going to have such a main character driven focus, I feel like there needs to be more of that sort of internal life and that those clues as to how Sharpe experiences the world that we just don't really get in this narrative.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's not a particularly. I would say he doesn't have complex thoughts, is the thing, which is interesting. I like to just describe Sharpe's relationship with the army as army great, made me me. Officer's bad, officer's stupid, terrible, hate him. And that's basically it.
Yeah, I know it's not necessarily a priority because of how one dimensional Sharpe and the rest, and especially the supporting cast can be. And I'm almost wondering if it's a detriment of Cornwell's particular style and goals for the narrative.
Well, yeah, I just don't think it's a priority. The story exists to be cool and do cool things. And character work is not a priority in that model, just as it's not a priority in a lot of adventure fiction. Nobody like reads or watches James Bond for the character work, for example, because there basically isn't any. But that's the kind of thing you get with a lot of adventure fiction. So, this is part of the whole shtick, and it is a shtick that kind of causes some weird issues because, well, frankly, this entire book follows Sharpe around, and Sharpe mostly just does stuff and doesn't really have much in the way of character growth or development, either in this book or almost in any book. His development is all circumstantial. He gets promotions, has relationships, has children. Everything around that is just like a circumstance that happens rather than a development in the character which occurs. And this is obviously getting into books that are not this one. This is why the books kind of blend together, because the main character that you're following the whole time just doesn't have that much of a personality, of a fully developed, fleshed out, complex internal personality that you would get in a lot of other character driven stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's the one thing that really I struggled with this book, but also with the genre in general. That long form pieces of media really do need to have these sort of overarching character arcs or have some sort of internality to make them really all that interesting to me.
Yeah, yeah. And like there are like speaking of long pieces of media, like there are TV shows that are like this for me. The X-Files is a big one where it's like I don't feel any need to watch every episode of the show because it's so episodic, it doesn't really fully develop. Now the difference there is that despite the fact the show's that long and episodic, the character work is done in a more meaningful way. So even if many of the characters don't develop a huge amount, they do develop somewhat. They do explore character work here and there, even if it doesn't produce massive long-term character arc changes in the personalities of the characters. Like there's a reason a lot of people really like Mulder and Scully as main characters, even though they don't develop a huge amount or have massive character arcs. They do have distinct and actually complex personalities when the show bothers to deal with them, which I think it's fair to say that what is it, like 11 seasons of TV? Yeah, you'd hope for that, much like you'd hope for that with 21 novels in a book series.
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking into this, I almost wondered if one of the biggest issues for that sort of long form character development is just the fact that the books aren't being written in order.
Yeah, that probably doesn't help.
Like we've already talked about how the author himself struggled with keeping the events of his own stories in line and in order in his head because these things are being sometimes published 20 years apart. So it's kind of hard to remember what character development is happening when. Hell, Cornwell sometimes forget what rank Sharpe is supposed to be.
Yeah, and that doesn't shock me at all. Between Sharpe's Eagle and Sharpe's Siege, which is the next book that was written, there's a 4-year time skip. And then that 4-year time skip gets filled in by other novels written later.
Well, and then he has to go back and fill in the gaps as he goes.
Well, yeah, and like it's fair because A, marketability, Cornwell's hitting the big historical events people might recognize first. So you hit Talavera in this book, you hit the Siege of Badajoz in the next book. You hit those two, you hit a few other big historical ones that people are more likely to recognize, and then you go and you write the stuff that is around much less well-known events. Also, because I don't think Cornwell ever really planned for this series to be a coherent plan. It just sort of happened. To a degree, fair enough. I get that.
And I mean, even though we're saying that, it's clearly a successful formula. Like,
Oh yeah, no, like this series is very successful. There's a reason why it's successful. You can just buy any of the novels, you can just read it. It's fairly enjoyable. It won't wow you, it won't blow your socks off, but
yeah, I mean, I enjoyed my first read, not so much my second, but I don't necessarily think that these books are meant to be critically read like an academic would.
that was a mistake.
That was a mistake.
Well, yeah, and we are not the target audience. So moving forward from that,
Yeah, we can move on. Let's move on to the main conflict. It's the time for the main conflict. Here he comes. He's coming. He's big. He's red. He's fat. He looks a bit like a pig and is unspeakably ugly.
Okay, you please don't.
Everybody put your hands together for Major Henry Simerson.
I think Colonel actually.
Oh, he's a colonel?
Yeah, he's a colonel.
Oh. Well, shows how much I remembered of this plot.
We can't even get his name. We can't even get his rank right. So yeah, and that's his defining feature.
He's the
His
worst.
his only defining feature is being horrible in every way.
Yes. Simerson is the. I struggle to call him a villain, so let's call him the antagonist because he's not really competent enough to be a
Yeah.
villain. But yeah, we'll go with that. So Simerson is very much a foil to Sharpe. He's arrogant, overbearing, overconfident.
Well, or rather, most confident but least competent. Yeah. So Sharpe obviously begins the book as a straggler, following the retreat into Portugal. Then gets lumped in, or rather, tasked with a mission to do alongside Simerson's regiment, the South Essex, which, for the record, is fictional. There's a reason it doesn't have a number. Numbers would be appropriate in this period. It does not have one because it does not exist in real life.
Oh, okay. I was desperately trying to remember if it did have a number. It
Nope.
doesn't. Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah, no, it should have one because the locality titles are informal in this period. They are not the formal designation. That is an intentional wink at the audience. The exact backstory of the South Essex, who will be following for the rest of the story, because Sharpe will then get lumped into them in perhaps one of the worst decisions ever. Their existence is somewhat of a mystery to me. The book, I think, says that Simerson raised them personally, which is something that people could do in this period, yes. It was not at all common by 1809. From the way it's described, Simerson came over from a militia regiment, used the back door of having rank in the militia to then get a transfer into the regular army, and raised this unit himself. It's not clear whether it was a militia unit he raised himself and that he somehow took that over into the army, which I don't think is possible in this period. What I presume it's supposed to be, which is that he and most of the officers that he brought with him came from a militia regiment he was in, and he personally did all the paying and equipping to actually raise this regiment as part of the regular army.
yeah,
So
I
the
think that's what the
officers
book
that,
said.
yeah,
Yeah, the men are new, but the some of the officers, especially the ones that he's sort of nepo babied
yeah,
in, are from the militia.
which is yeah, because again, Summerston is literally the worst, and then some of them have actually been appointed in properly, and so that's where this comes in, and this introduces a whole bunch of conflicts because Sharpe does not go one chapter from the South Essex appearing on screen to being assaulted by one of its officers, partially because he's an idiot, and actively pissing off Summerson pretty much immediately by not dressing like an officer, which actually is one of the only reasonable opinions Summerson has. So there you go.
Yeah, Sharpe's sort of this dirty, wild man, and he's. The book goes into several paragraphs. It describes how he's stolen a pair of breeches off a chasseur captain or colonel, whatever. And also that he's found a pair of boots off a Frenchman and that they fit Sharpe in particular perfectly, which is strange because Sharpe's a very tall, large man. And it really just sucks for the rest of the men because Sharpe got lucky and found these boots. And the rest of them are wearing these crappy old boots that they've been marching in for several months.
It spent an entire paragraph describing that.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, so yeah, Sharpe is not dressed professionally. And it's sort of understandable why a fellow officer might not immediately recognize him as one of them.
Yeah. So, yeah, and it's very, very explicitly stated during this whole encounter that he does not have any rank insignia anymore, which is a reasonable problem, considering that, they've been in Spain for like a year, and he has also been through a pretty bad winter march and probably has not had any opportunity to actually replace any of these things.
Well, and there's also the problem that Sharpe would have to probably pay for the replacement of those insignia.
Yeah, which is a problem he actually has in common with a lot of junior officers in this period, which the novel does not really bring up. So, you don't have to just be.
Well, and we also know that Sharpe does not make good financial decisions.
No, but basically, because he decides to be a stuck up prick about this when he gets challenged for his rank, he basically gets assaulted and then proceeds to, for no apparent reason, make himself an enemy of Lieutenant Gibbons and the Colonel, because Sharpe doesn't know how to not be a jerk, and neither do either of these characters. This is a very simple conflict over basically both sides having massive egos, and only one of those sides is actually acknowledged as having a massive and unhealthy ego, and surprise, surprise, it's not Sharpe. It's hard to really care about this conflict in some ways because they're both kind of just jerks.
The big problem is this is really the only conflict we've got.
Yeah, no, this is the conflict the entire plot hinges on.
Yeah, the French really do not have a whole lot to do with the
No,
conflict of this, despite being ostensibly the people they're in
yeah,
conflict with.
which is fine. In many ways, that works well because, we're never going to be able to get any deep character work on the French because, unsurprisingly, you're not going to meet them very much if you're in the British Army, other than on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one interaction that Sharpe does have with the French, with the French chasseur colonel, is actually really good. It's one of my favorite parts of the story, in fact.
That was a really good scene. It's very reminiscent of a lot of stuff that you will get in this period of officers discussing things under truce, or enlisted people whenever there's scavenging or looting to be done, just going over and socializing with the enemy because, well, why not?
Yeah, I think it's a really effective scene in that it shows that most of these men really are only there because it's a job. It's what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and not a particularly pleasant job that they actually cared about. So, yeah, it makes sense. I'm reminded of the particular encounter in the first volume of War and Peace, where one of the main characters notices that one of the Russian enlisted men has gone over and is having an animated discussion in the between the two armies' lines with a French grenadier. And then the story cuts away, and the explanation that you get is that these two soldiers are arguing vociferously about who exactly won in the previous battle because none of them have any idea, which is quite funny, and also much like the scene that you're referencing. Yeah, that's a thing that happens in this period. It just happens. But to return to Sharpe versus Simerson, the conflict doesn't really go very much of anywhere. I mean, it goes a lot of places, but it doesn't really deepen any of the character work.
Well, and it can't really because the narrative's warping itself so aggressively around Sharpe, and there's this clear difference in competencies.
Yeah, Sharpe is is unrealistically competent and apparently can basically know everything about tactics and do it all basically himself, which is very surprising for a subaltern. And Simerson is so completely inept as a regimental commander and has staffed his regiment with completely inept idiots for the most part. Every time the conflict goes somewhere, Sharpe does something competent, Simerson tries to screw him over, repeat ad nauseam.
Yeah, and we go through like 3 or 4 cycles of this. There's several major kind of points of conflict within the story, and once we're nearing the end, it's almost looking like Simerson's finally starting to respect Sharpe and listen to his opinions, but then
Yeah, and then he doesn't. And the book ends.
and then the book ends.
Yeah, yeah. And if that's the one big conflict in the story, it's sort of weirdly intertwined with with a theme that comes up a lot in this, which is sort of Sharpe's relationship with the army. How exactly it's intertwined is difficult to really suss out, which is kind of the issue. It's difficult to tell if Simerson is supposed to be, and I think in some ways he's supposed to be, representative of what the Army's purchase system allows to happen. Basically, just rich idiots buy their commission and don't know how to do anything. On the other hand, we have officers like Lawford or Wellington himself, who are presented quite competently and who did literally this. It's difficult to come up with any solid foundation there. I mean, the only character conflict we have there really is that Sharpe hates the Army's emphasis on class and emphasis on birth and connections, but he acts out on this like a petulant child at times, is generally successful in doing so because obviously this is the author's sympathies, and the conflict doesn't go anywhere because there's nowhere for it really to go other than Sharpe just acting out randomly.
Yeah, my read on it is almost like the army is Sharpe's vaguely abusive parent, and he is the petulant toddler who is acting out. The issue is the plot is letting him do that.
Yeah. And part of the issue here is also just that the ways in which Sharpe does this sort of thing are not ways that would be helpful in real life. For example, his very mismatched uniform, which he's quite proud of, does make it hard for people to tell that you're an officer, which can cause a problem when you run into another officer who then gets mad at you because he thinks you're being insubordinate. This is a completely reasonable misunderstanding. Well, yeah, Gibbons is a jackass in that situation, but it's a reasonable misunderstanding and is kind of, you would think that the character would go, okay, maybe I should dress like an officer and not cause issues like this. But no, Sharpe does not do that because Sharpe is the protagonist and right about everything.
But you don't understand. He has to have his French cavalry trousers and his boots because he's very cool.
Dress for the job you want, Sharpe.
In reality, an officer like that really wouldn't be doing himself that many favors by being a complete slob.
Yeah, which is the issue. And it's like if you needed a new uniform, Hogan would be like, "Yeah, here, take some of my money. You can pay me back later." Which is hilariously actually very realistic. Like, you look at the culture dynamics in the 19th century British Army, officers are like just spiking each other money all the time. Most of them know what it's like to be poor because this profession doesn't pay you well enough to live. Sharpe keeps complaining at various points in this novel and later ones that, oh, other officers have it so much better. They have so much money. And it's like, they don't.
Well, Sharpe's hardly spending his money wisely or making that many friends who would loan him some.
Well, yeah, and the novel doesn't bring this out because I think the novel agrees with Sharpe. But the problem is that's not historically accurate.
And I get the sense, and I might be correct, that there's a real sense of collegiality with officers of this time period.
Yes.
I mean, it's a shame that doesn't really come out in the book.
Yeah, and part of the issue is that the book never takes us into regimental life. The regiment largely exists as a character delivery device to move Sharpe from location to location so he can do heroic things. And we don't get the curtain lifted and get a look inside what actually living and working as part of the regiment is like. There is one scene in this book where the officers' mess is mentioned in passing, but the officers' mess is never used as a social scenario or a social encounter.
I mean, I think there is one scene.
They mention it, but they don't give us much time in it.
No, around the middle of the book, all the officers of the South Essex get together.
Right, yes, I remember that now. It doesn't last very long.
Yeah, and that scene doesn't really do much apart from being another incident in the conflict between Sharpe, Simerson, and Simerson's cronies.
Yeah, and part of the issue there also is that mess scenes like that can let you engage with people that aren't the commanding officer of the regiment, because you're going to have what would establishment be? The South Essex is at full strength, so 2 majors, 10 captains, and probably, 2 majors, 10 captains, 10 lieutenants, and a similar number of ensigns. And they would all be there. Like, this is a massive table. There is no reason for this to turn into Simerson just randomly decides to pick on Sharpe. More realistically, he just ignore him and talk to other people. Yeah, which is another sign that Simerson runs his regiment badly, but whether that's, I don't think it's intentional.
Yeah, really what it is, it's a big missed opportunity to expand the other characters, the other officers that we know exist in the regiment. We've been introduced to them, they've been given a certain amount of characterization, but they never really get the fully flushed out character traits that they need to be actually important to the plot, and they're not really able to give us a good example of what this sort of camaraderie between the officers would have actually been like during the time period where you probably get certain amounts of groups forming friendships and sort of internal politicking, but at the same time, uh, all these men are more or less on the same side, and that just doesn't come across in the few scenes that we get with the entire, functionally the entire cast of the novel.
And so a lot of this just isn't there, and because this stuff isn't there, we don't get to really explore this stuff. And if we did, the way Sharpe behaves most of the time would probably come off quite badly because he doesn't play well with other people. He actively tries not to make friends. He has questionable priorities, to say the least. And generally speaking, things like the fact that most of the officers in this period don't actually have money, that Sharpe's problem is not a unique one. I mean, I'm not sure Cornwell's aware of that at the time when he's writing this book. I suspect he's not, but that's the sort of thing that you can only really flesh out if you flesh out other characters and sort of flesh out the social situation of the unit. Now, this has no function in a military adventure story, but in a military drama, this would have a lot more value to it. And and this brings up the other thing that, because army life doesn't get brought up much here, Sharpe's, for a book that cares so much about class, oh my god, enlisted characters have even less personality than everybody else. They are like a name that shows up randomly, and either corporately as a unit or as individuals, they have basically no function in the plot, unless their name is Harper.
Yeah, I think treating them as just a masked entity, as functionally non characters, really does a disservice to when we get to the parts where we're really starting to supposed to care about the individual experience of fighting a war and about, oh, these men are dying, and we should care.
Yeah, and the issue is just that they're mostly just not even on screen. And obviously, when you're dealing with the horse and musket period, it's hard to figure out how to do this because units move in large blocks and large formations. Certainly in battle sequences, it may feel awkward or unnatural to get down to the how do the troops react to this thing happening level. But unfortunately, both in battles and outside of them, Cornwell mostly just deals in convenient building blocks. So he'll say, the company did X, pretty much like that. And you will never really get more of a description, which both makes the descriptions of battle kind of weird because they're often not very emotive, but also means that the army life stuff of what Sharpe's job is actually supposed to be as company commander, administration, discipline, dealing with the men, making sure that they're fed and clothed and not doing stupid shit. That stuff just doesn't come up. Instead, Sharpe gets to hit things with a sword, and it's like, I want to see him doing his job.
Yeah, it really makes me wonder what Cornwell thinks an officer actually does. And in my mind, I've almost started to distinguish it as like there's two command styles, and only two command styles. There is a commander who maintains discipline through the threat of violence and punishment, and there is the commander that imposes the loyalty of their men through sheer force of personality and charisma, and not much else.
I think you're right because I'm pretty sure that was where the historiography on Napoleonic armies at least the Napoleonic British Army, was at in the 60s and 70s, when the sources Cornwell would have had to draw on to write this were from. And it's not really true. Later historiography has definitely exposed a lot of that as like not really how that works. But that was sort of a trope at the time of the sort of almost Marxian social history school of emphasizing soldiers are the worst elements of society, kept in line by being given lots of alcohol and threatened with savage punishments if they do anything, and generally used as cannon fodder by uncaring, rich, and detached officers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a specialist in the time period, but really my impression of what the role of an officer is supposed to be is as a sort of middle manager. They're there to ensure that their men are well drilled, disciplined, and equipped enough to fight when they are asked to and to have the morale they need to do so.
Yeah, and that is the main job of, in the era of linear warfare, the horse and musket period, that stuff, that is the main job of every officer below the regiment's colonel, and arguably the majors, depending on how the regiment's deployed. Certainly company level officers, captains, then the subalterns, the lieutenants, and the ensigns within each company. Yeah, their entire job is to do this stuff. Keep morale functioning, keep discipline intact. And that is never as simple as, oh, you did this thing. We're going to go flog you now. It didn't work that way. I would point you towards our mutual friend who studies this in the Navy for some great examples as to how that works.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that guess was more or less on point because, I mean, I'm a Roman historian and this is the exact way that the Roman army works.
Or every army.
Yeah, I mean, this is just sort of how military order functions.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's weird in that we don't see Sharpe doing that. The one thing we do see Sharpe doing is having his men get rid of their stocks, which yes, everybody hated those. That is historically accurate, and then burn them.
That's maybe not entirely fair. We do get one scene where we see Sharpe working through his company's daybook,
The accounting scene, yeah.
and it's the one time we see Sharpe sort of start to bend the rules.
Yes, which is good. I'm glad that was in there because a lot of people don't seem to realize that there was actual paperwork for these people to do.
Yeah, we see a little bit of him organizing the minutiae of keeping his men supplied, which is really one of his main jobs as an officer, is making sure that they're fairly supplied.
Yeah, and those bits and pieces, which I wish we got more on, those are great. The issue is a lot of that seems to be presented as because he was working class like they are. And it's like, nope, every officer is doing this if they're any good at their job.
I think Cornwell during these scenes does a reasonable job of emphasizing the supply situation, but I think that its impact on morale is probably treated somewhat weirdly. It's not like men will just start randomly pillaging and looting unless their supply situation really is dire. There has to be a pretty good reason for people to break their discipline, especially within an outfit like the British Army at this time.
Yeah, and that is a thing that happens repeatedly in armies in this period, but as a lot of, again, more recent studies have emphasized, that has a lot more to do with the fact that especially the British Army in this period has a hell of a hard time actually getting food. Whenever they get the opportunity, British troops will tend to just loot, but they're going to be primarily aiming towards, in a lot of those situations, seem to be primarily aiming towards getting as much food and alcohol as they can find because, oh my God, we are starving constantly. Please send help. Which is a huge problem that never really gets resolved in Spain until very late in the war. Mixture of bad management in the commissary department, poor funding for supplies, and poor systems for actually shipping it out to the theater, and dependence on the Spanish, who, as the book actually does point out, because of how screwed up the Spanish junta's management of basically everything is, they had a lot of trouble feeding their own army, let alone the British.
Yeah, I think Cornwell makes it fairly clear how much of a disaster the Spanish were at this time with their logistics and actually managing to get much of anything done. It's really kind of interesting as to why that was when they were on, I guess, home field advantage. But yeah, it seems to have been a mess.
Yeah, and part of the issue there as well is that the Spanish never get fully, yeah, in basically none of these books do the Spanish get fully expanded on, or the Spanish military fully get expanded on. And that's largely just because the scholarship wasn't there. The Spanish army in this period is still massively understudied in English. Even in Spanish, it's understudied. It's kind of amazing, but we still don't really have a good understanding of why a lot of the bizarre things the Spanish army does in the events this book is set during actually happen. We just don't know.
So I think we've hit the main points we wanted to talk about with military life, discipline, officers, and culture. What do you say we move on to the battle scenes?
Yeah, let's get to the battle scenes, style and substance, because there's some interesting stuff to unpack there. Actually, before we do that, I do think I want to point one thing out about what officers' jobs are in this period, and the culture that actually goes into military leadership, which is not one of, snubbing your nose at authority and bending the rules in the way that Sharpe does, but bending the rules constantly because the rules are meant to be bent. If you want to look for good sources for the culture of officers in the army, I'm not sure you can do any better than a particular quote from the Duke of Wellington himself. Now, this is from 1833, but much of the philosophy here is quite relevant. The army didn't change that much between 1810 and 1830. From the moment at which the officer enters Her Majesty's service until he attains the rank of general officer, he must be prepared to serve in all climates, in all seasons, in all situations, and under every possible difficulty and disadvantage. There will be no peace or repose for him, excepting that some powerful party in the state should think that his services can be dispensed with, in which case he will be put upon half pay. While serving, he must perform all the duties required of him. He must be, in turn, policeman, jailer, magistrate, judge, and jury, whether in peace or in war, in the transport and charge of convicts, or acting as a magistrate, or sitting in judgment, or as a juryman, or engaged in the more immediate and more active duties of performing his profession in the field. He must never make a mistake. He must never cease to be an officer and a gentleman, cheerful, obedient, subordinate to his superiors, yet maintaining discipline and securing the affection and attachment of his subordinates and of the soldiers placed under his command, upon scanty pay and allowances, so small in some instances as not to be sufficient to pay for his own lodgings. He has little hope of promotion unless he can purchase it, nor of rest nor relief from his exertions if he should obtain it, as long as he has health and the strength to serve. That is a generalization, talking about all officers in the army, and that does sound rather similar to Sharpe, but um, Sharpe seems to think, and the novel seems to think, that his problems are unique, and they're not at all.
So I think we were going to talk about the battles.
Yeah, I find that the way battles are described in this book, we zoom out in ways that feel extremely precise yet extremely abstract, and then zoom in ways that feel like they just aren't very descriptive. And like part of this is just that Cornwell generally tends to describe things in battle as X did Y. The battalion formed line. The mechanics, the deeper stuff going on often doesn't get described. But it often feels like the descriptions are very weird and floaty. Like I completely lose track of where units are relative to each other, even in the small fight for the bridge halfway through the book. And I don't know if that's a unique experience. I'd be curious for your thoughts.
I honestly think that first small, entirely fictional battle for the bridge is probably the best conflict of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because it's on the relatively smaller scale of things.
Yeah, and I still managed to completely lose track of which side of the bridge Sharpe's company is on during that,
Yeah,
which is
and
really important, and I just completely lose track of it in the narrative.
yeah, and that's really an issue. I mean, I found that that moment where they actually do go over the bridge isn't really well described, so it's kind of like, oh, they're there now.
I mean, much like his company as a whole, they exist purely to deliver him to locations where he can hit things. And it's just kind of hilarious because I assumed they were already on the other side of the bridge. And it's like, oh, they need to cross the bridge. I'm like, I
Yeah,
thought they were there already.
yeah, where they spend a good amount of time describing the maneuvers that it takes for the British and the Spanish to get over the bridge and get into something resembling a square. And then it's kind of a moment where the French are attacking, and then Sharpe very quickly gets his company over the bridge and sort of tries to do like a heroic intervention.
Which mostly comes down to him and Harper hitting things with swords.
Him and Sharper.
Yeah, I
Uh,
know. Stupid. But
yeah, well, and that's the issue. He yells a few orders and then makes contact with the enemy. I think one of the things about Sharpe that doesn't make him a very good officer is the fact that, well, two really. He always has his rifle with him, and he always has his officer, or sorry, not his officer's sword, his cavalry sword, which he uses despite being an infantryman.
I'd also like to point out just how hard that actual sword would be to use on foot.
I Yeah,
It's
I mean
it's a handicap. That should not be an asset. Like if you've
that
looked at the actual thing, it's huge.
it's really not meant for swinging just with arm power. It's really meant for that extra momentum and height that you get from being on horseback. So using it as an infantryman is just odd, especially in this period
Yeah.
where I
Well,
mean
yeah,
like that as an officer.
you need it to defend yourself and to
Yeah,
fight, absolutely. But it's also like, I mean, it's less that and more just he shouldn't be. We shouldn't completely lose sight of the unit the moment that Sharp enters combat.
yeah.
But
I mean,
but we barely have any sight on the unit when he's not in combat, so nothing changes.
yeah, I think there's a solid argument to be made that as a lieutenant trying to command a company, Sharpe should not be in that thick of the combat. Anyways,
Yeah,
he should be a little bit further back, making sure his company's, morale, discipline, and ability to
yeah.
fight is still in order.
Yeah, or at least among them, rather than
Yeah,
pressing on ahead and seeing
yeah.
and like I guess hoping that they'll follow him.
But I think that's the thing about how Cornwell depicts leadership as working is it's like an aura. It's like sheer force of personality is how you command your men, even seemingly without words. Basically, if this was a war game, he would have a 12-inch bubble that allowed allowed the
Yeah.
men around him to use his leadership and re-roll rolls of one.
Yeah, yeah, it's a curious thing. Yeah, and like again, so much of this is just a result of the fact that A, battles are always just described as when the units come up, it's like the unit did this maneuver. And so much of it is that, and it's like, but I don't feel what it feels like to be watching the unit do the maneuver. I don't feel the human element. I don't feel like this is a group of human beings doing something. I feel like it's just an abstract, which is again, it ties into the whole issue with like everyone that's not Sharpe or Harper or Hogan. Like if they're not a named character, like major character, they kind of barely exist. Like it does make battle scenes kind of weird and kind of like they're engaging, but they're not emotive, at least not most of the time. I I know it's an unfair comparison, but as you know, about a year ago I read War and Peace. In reading Sharpe's Eagle now, I was struck by how Tolstoy is doing the thing that this book is missing in
Mhm.
describing battle.
Yeah,
Would you mind if I share a couple little excerpts here?
sure.
So, here's one example, a brief one. And this is of a squadron of Russian hussars, so cavalry, coming first under fire from enemy artillery. On the high ground where the enemy was, the smoke of a cannon rose, and a ball flew whistling over the heads of the squadron. The officers who had been standing together rode off to their places. The hussars began carefully aligning their horses. Silence fell across the whole squadron. All were looking at the enemy in front, and at the commander, awaiting his word of command. A second and a third ball flew past. Evidently they were firing at the hussars, but with rapid, rhythmic whistling, the balls flew over the heads of the horsemen and fell somewhere beyond them. The hussars did not look around, but at the sound of each shot, as at the words of command, the whole squadron, with its rows of faces, so alike and yet so different, held its breath while the balls flew past, rose in their stirrups, sank back again. The soldiers, without turning their heads, glanced towards each other, curious to see their comrades' impression. Every face, from Denisov's, the main characters, or the main character in the scene, to that of the bugler, showed one common expression: conflict, irritation, excitement, tension around the chin and the mouth. The quartermaster scowled, looking at the soldiers as if threatening to strike them. Cadet Mironov ducked every time a ball flew past. Lieutenant Rostov on the left flank, mounted on his rook, a handsome horse despite its game leg, had the happy air of a schoolboy called up before a large audience for an examination, glancing around with a clear, bright expression as if daring them to notice how calmly he sat under fire. Still, despite himself, on his face too, there was that same indication of something new, stern, frightened, around the mouth and the chin. Now, this is, one of the great masters of literature, but I think you can pick up on some of the stuff that's being done here about how combat is an emotive experience.
It's one of those things that there's never that sort of visceral, emotional, physical anticipation of combat, of fighting.
Yeah.
The idea that it's now kill or be killed, and even if you do a good job personally, you might still just get blown up by artillery.
Yeah,
and
or
there's nothing
to
you can really do about that.
yeah, and like that emotive experience and the fact that that is a corporate experience. He's getting into the corporate experience that the people in the main character's unit are experiencing around him. They are characters even if they're not named characters, even if they're characters as a body, as a company or a battalion, rather than, actual individual characters that we get fleshed out. But they are characters interacting with the world regardless, which Cornwell never really does, because with him it's always the battalion did blank.
Well, and an observation coming out of that is even later on in the scene we've been discussing, when Sharpe plans and executes an ambush, the men are still very much they're on the same level of instrument as Sharpe's sword. They're
Mm-hmm.
still acting at his will, and it is still only Sharpe's agency within the narrative that drives that action. And that's
Yeah.
really the issue, is that there really isn't any other agency. There aren't any other agents within the narrative.
Yeah.
It's an
And it's
agency of one, and Sharpe is the only agent within this novel. And that section from War and Peace really drives that home, where you get a greater sense that these are individual people with their internal worlds, and you get a very brief glimpse at them, but they're still there. I actually brought it up. The campaign of Battlefield 1, the opening section, did this really well. You were basically storming a line of machine guns, and you would take the control of every time you died, you take control of another person. But each time you died, you would be given a short summary of the person who had just been killed, the person that you had just driven into that field of fire and gotten killed, because it was you in the driver's seat at the time. And that's a really effective way of enforcing that each person in this war may not be significant, but they still matter.
yeah.
And I just never get that sense.
Yeah, and it's a weird disconnect that really does tie into the fact that Sharpe really isn't doing officer things. Like, he's not actually spending much time in the narrative doing the things that are actually most of that job. I just wish there was more of that. Like, by all means, go and hit people with your sword. That's cool. but the build up to that needs to be more officer-like, more realistic, for lack of a better word, to be really immersive and really sell you on what's going on.
This is a weird aside, but tying it back to something I've been doing recently is I've been coaching fencing. I've been teaching new fencers the basics of fencing, and really I spend more time not fencing during those sessions than I spend fencing, because what I'm doing is I'm observing the people around me and seeing, okay, this person's technique is weak in this way. I'm going to pull them aside and show them the thing they need to make them better in combat. So I think that when you're actually teaching people or instructing people or leading people on how to engage in combat, that ability to take a step back, observe the people around you that you're responsible for, and then be able to actually make those changes is really important. So it's those small things where Sharpe actually does or should be managing the combat, managing his men. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if we're going to use the corporate example, which I actually think is a really good example, a lieutenant is a middle manager.
Yeah.
Like that's their role. They're a middle manager. They've got a team that they are responsible for supervising. And that supervision is making sure that they are effectively doing their job, in this case, engaging in combat.
Yeah. In line or whatever formation it is, keeping formation, firing at the enemy, or otherwise doing whatever they're ordered to do. And that's a simple job, but it's also a very complex job in the way that war often is.
Yeah, and as I pointed out, it's that sort of ability to observe and instruct that I think makes a good officer, makes a good
Yeah.
leader in general. Honestly, is knowing the individual you're looking at, what they need to be more efficient and better
Yeah.
at that what they're doing, and then making sure that they have the skills, knowledge, and resources to do that. And that's really the officer's job. And Sharpe's not doing any of that, or he's not
Yeah.
depicted as doing any of that.
Yeah, which is kind of the issue. It's like he should be, but he's not.
Yeah.
And like obviously in this period it's a little bit different as well because there's the emphasis on the officer being very distant and on discipline being enough and staying in formation and doing what you're told. But there are still ways you can work that in. I'm I'm tempted to use another illustrative passage from Tolstoy if you'll forgive me.
No, that is completely forgivable. I do
Yeah.
need to finish reading War and Peace, especially
Well,
these sections.
like I'll be honest, I think the thing that like makes War and Peace amazing to me is the actual war part.
Yeah, and I didn't get to that bit.
Yeah, like the relationship stuff is great once it gets going, and it's really good, but it does take a long time to really get going. But
Here,
the
here is 50 pages of Russian court politics that you have to get through first.
Yeah, and
And
unfortunately, another 50 pages of Tolstoy ranting about historical theory, which is the real problem in my opinion.
I get
But
enough. I get enough of that on my day
yeah,
to day life right now. Do not need
yeah,
more of that at all.
no, and but his descriptions of military life, both because he was someone who had served in the Crimean War, which was obviously still very much within the same historical milieu as the Napoleonic period. I think that gives a lot of. I think it's clear that he's writing the military stuff from the perspective of someone who has experienced something similar and can relate.
Well, and I think that's the biggest issue here is that it's entirely possible that Tolstoy had access to, well, apart from his own experiences, had access to people who had probably by this point secondhand knowledge of the war.
Yeah, and I believe he did. Though
I
I
don't think
mean,
that would have been hard.
no. And certainly other people who served in Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're talking about the experience of combat, the Crimean War and the Napoleonic War are like two steps away from each other. They're very much
Yeah.
in the same world. And so when we want to talk about how officers behave with their men, this is during a lull in combat and again under artillery fire. But I think this section is really telling and interesting. So this is with Prince Andrew, who is one of the biggest main characters of this massive novel. And at this point, he's commanding a Russian infantry regiment. Prince Andrew's regiment was among the reserves, which, until after 1 o'clock, this is during Borodino, so this is during the big Battle of Borodino at the center of the novel, in 1812. Prince Andrew's regiment was among the reserves, which, till after 1 o'clock, were stationed inactive behind Semenovsk under heavy artillery fire. Towards 2 o'clock, the regiment, having already lost more than 200 men, was moved forward into a trampled oat field in the gap between Semenovsk and the Knoll battery, where thousands of men perished that day, and on which an intense, concentrated fire from several hundred guns was directed between 1 and 2 o'clock. So, like Cornwell, in the introduction here, we've zoomed out and we're looking at the overall situation that the characters are in within the context of the battle. But Tolstoy's gone right ahead and just dumped it in that paragraph and then moves on. And then you go with that paragraph and a following one, transitioning, you then get to, without moving from that spot or firing a single shot, the regiment here lost another third of its men. From in front, and especially from the right, in the unlifting smoke, the guns boomed, and out of the mysterious domain of smoke that overlay the whole space, quick hissing cannonballs and slow whistling shells fell unceasingly. At times, as if to allow them a respite, a quarter of an hour would pass, during which no balls or shells flew overhead. But sometimes several men were torn from the regiment in a minute, and the slain were continually being dragged away and the wounded carried off. That's the transition paragraph, and that's very Cornwell, just slightly differently articulated. You're looking at what's the unit experiencing, and it's detached. And then we go to the next paragraph, and we move in, zooming in again. With each fresh blow, less and less chance of life remained for those not yet killed. The regiment stood in columns of battalion 300 paces apart, but nevertheless the men were always in one and the same mood. All alike were taciturn and morose. Talk was rarely heard, and it ceased altogether every time the thud of a shell landed and the cry of "Stretcher bearers!" was heard. Most of the time, by their officers' orders, the men sat. One, having taken off his shako, carefully loosened the gathers of its lining and drew them tight again. Another, rubbing some dry clay between his palms, polished his bayonet. Another fingered the strap and buckle of his bandolier, while another smoothed and refolded his leg bands and put his boots back on. Some built little houses of the tufts in the plowed ground, or plaited baskets from the straw in the cornfield. All seemed fully absorbed in these pursuits. When men were killed or wounded, when rows of stretcher-bearers went past, when some men fled, and when great masses of the enemy came into view through the smoke, no one paid much attention to these things. But when the artillery or the cavalry advanced, or some of our infantry were seen to move forward, words of approval would be heard on all sides. But the liveliest attention was attracted by occurrences quite apart from the battle. It was as if the minds of the men, exhausted, found relief in commonplace occurrences. A few things happen, things move forward. We jump forward another paragraph, skipping one here. And we go to the regimental commander. Prince Andrew, pale and gloomy like everyone in the unit, paced up and down from the border of one patch to another, at the edge of a meadow beside the oat field, with head bowed and arms behind his back. There was nothing for him to do, no orders to be given. Everything went on of itself. The dead were dragged from the front, the wounded carried away, the ranks closed up. If any soldiers ran to the rear, they were brought back immediately, hastily. At first the prince, considering it his duty to rouse the courage of the men and to set an example, walked about among the ranks. But he soon became convinced that this was unnecessary. There was nothing he could do for them. All the powers of his soul, as of every soldier there, were unconsciously bent on avoiding the contemplation of the horror of their situation. He walked among the meadow, dragging his feet, rustling the grass, and gazing at the dust that covered his boots. Now he took big strides, trying to keep to the footprints left on the meadow by the mowers. Then he counted his steps, calculating how often he must walk from one strip to another to walk a mile. Nothing remained of his previous day's thoughts, of anything, really. He thought of nothing. He listened with weary ears to the ever-recurring sound, distinguishing the whistle of flying projectiles from the booming of their report, glanced at the tiresomely familiar faces of the men of his battalion, and waited. Here it comes, another one, he thought, listening to the approaching whistle in the hidden smoke. One, another, again. Hit. He stopped, looked up. No, gone over. And again, he started trying to reach the boundary strip, 16 paces still. Whiz, thud, 5 paces from him, a cannonball tore up the earth, disappeared again. Again, he glanced at the ranks. Probably a few had been hit. A large crowd gathered near the 2nd Battalion. Adjutant, he ordered. Order them not to crowd together. His adjutant, obeying this, approached him. From the other side, a battalion commander rode up. "Look out!" came a frightened cry from a soldier, and like a bird whirring in rapid flight, a shell dropped with little noise within 2 steps of the prince, close to his battalion commander's horse. The horse first, regardless of whether it was right or wrong to show fear, snorted, reared, throwing the major, and galloped aside, its terror infecting the men. And this continues, and things go, and, this is one part of this big chapter. It ends with a shell hitting the prince and mortally wounding him. But yeah, spoiler alert, Andrew dies. But it's just illustrating that situation and illustrating what an officer does, and in this case illustrating when there's nothing more that can be done, and the kind of thoughts that crawl around in your head when you're just pacing in this horse and musket era where you don't really take cover and you don't really do things like that, and you're just sitting in the open waiting to see if your number comes up. And obviously, does this have any bearing to Sharpe? Maybe not really, but this is a very different way to approach it. And I'm like, I don't know. It's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't spend as much time on the specifics of what is actually going on in the grander scheme of things. Mostly because the character doesn't really have access to that.
Yeah, and that's the way Tolstoy does all of this. You are focusing on what the character is doing, and you get so much of a better sense of that. But when you do zoom out, and when you do get a character who actually has that bigger scope, you get more of a description.
Yeah, and I think the big issue really is that because the plot locks itself so aggressively to Sharpe, Sharpe only gets that big picture occasionally before the plot delivers him to combat.
Yeah.
So there's a section early in the Battle of Talavera where the actual unit level movements and the broader scale of things is made clear. But that sort of disappears the moment that Sharpe and his light company get pushed forward to skirmish. And then it becomes a very focused. Whereas if the book was actually using multiple points of view, then there would be a greater opportunity to describe what is happening around Sharpe and then zoom back in to describe how he is dealing with it.
Yeah.
Which would have actually been quite interesting.
Yeah, and especially if the way in which he dealt with things was had more around it than he hits things with sword.
Yeah, not just there is a greater challenge, so he is going to hit things with sword harder than he was previously.
Sometimes Sharpe feels like a Dungeons and Dragons character, to be honest.
It's a very grug way of approaching a main character where if the only tool that he has is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. He just sort of bludgeons the problems in front of him into submission, and then they go away eventually.
Like, the plot itself sort of caters to that by having the villains be so horrible that they basically just walk into situations where it becomes justifiable for Sharpe to then just murder them.
Yeah, let's pivot to that. I think we've gotten through everything we wanted to talk about with, like, the actual that was conflict, but it wasn't the conflict. Now let's talk about the conflict.
Yeah. So, yeah, I basically Simerson's cronies, Lieutenants Gibbons and Barry, who exist to be evil apparently, Gibbons has a girlfriend. His girlfriend ends up becoming Sharpe's girlfriend because, again, for some insane reason, Sharpe is very attractive to women in all of these books, despite dressing like a slob. But suffice it to
Dressing like a
say,
slob and behaving like a dick. Just the
yeah.
perfect man for somebody with really severe issues.
Well, yeah, it's like, I mean, we joke about James Bond, but hey, Sean Connery is a very charming person. He has an
Bond,
excuse at least.
I mean, Bond has always been described as suave and well dressed and actually
Yeah.
polite to the people he interacts with. So Sharpe takes the complete opposite approach to seduction somehow.
Well, he doesn't even intentionally do it. It just happens. And that is a theme. Every time it happens in these books, it just sort of happens. And it's like, okay,
Okay.
well, whatever.
It's the required romantic subplot. Here you go. There it is.
Exactly. That's
We're
the
gonna
issue.
waste like 50 pages on this. It's
Yeah.
only 300 pages. Like it's a full fifth of the book.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
Yeah.
We'll
And
get
so
there.
anyway,
Let's stick
yeah.
with the two morons or the
Yeah.
Three Stooges. Let's stick with the Three Stooges. Of
Okay,
this
so yeah, Gibbons and Barry get mad about this for reasons that make no sense, uh, because they're evil, and then because of course Simerson protects them from all actual discipline because apparently he can't manage officers any better than he can manage anybody else. They basically get away with being dickheads to everybody all the time, and then by the end of the book, because they hate Sharpe for stealing Gibbons's girlfriend, even though Gibbons was
gonna
trying to get rid
murder
of her
her.
anyway. Yeah.
Let's try to
What?
get rid of her permanently.
Yeah. So anyway, so they decide to rape her. So Sharpe murders them. That's how the plot gets resolved. And then Simerson decides to be even more of an idiot than usual and comes to the conclusion that the battle, which is going perfectly reasonably, is actually hopeless and tries to retreat with the entire regiment and then gets relief of command, and which he should have been much earlier.
He tries to use his light company in the same way that I use a unit of Hormagots when I'm playing Warhammer, as a speed bump.
Well, to be fair, he tries to use the entire army as that, but because he's an idiot, in fact, the battle is going fine and nothing bad is actually happening.
Correctly.
It's one of those moments where you're like, Simerson is so stupid. The book obviously tries to be like, well, he has political protection, that's why he is here. And I'm like, he's just so obviously stupid. I mean, the thing with this is he would come with the regiment pretty much regardless, but I have a hard time imagining that horse guards, even in this period where, like, yeah, patronage matters, they're going to look at the guy and be like, okay, he wants an overseas posting. Has he done anything? No. Well, unit's new. He hasn't really done anything. Send him to garrison somewhere. There's plenty of options for people to go to Spain. Like, they're not short on that. So it's like, is it possible that he could get sent there? Yeah. And again, the higher levels are pretty obscured, but whatever brigade he ended up in, the brigade commander would probably be pretty much immediately going, okay, this guy's a dumbass.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep an eye on him. And then he'd basically probably be getting micromanaged by the brigadier, which would be fine because, again, within the linear warfare horse and musket era thing, the brigadier can just micro you, and then Simerson doesn't get to make decisions for himself. But again, that doesn't really appear in the book, and it seems like Simerson can just do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Which isn't really true.
Well, and he's also he's the other archetype of officer that Cornwell seems to believe that exists, which is mostly just maintaining discipline through the threat of violence. He's very distinctly described as a flogger, believing that military discipline is mostly just enforced through punishment. And undoubtedly there were probably officers like that.
Oh, there were. The thing with those officers is that weirdly, some of them were very popular with their men, which you will not get out of Cornwell, but it is true, and it is very weird. And the thing with it is being a flogging officer who takes the regulations for corporal punishment as, rules, not guidelines, depends on how you do it.
Yeah.
If you're good at your job and you still do that, nobody will like you, but they'll respect you. If you are very clear about where the lines are and what you expect from people, it still works. Like the light division was commanded by Robert Crawford, who was very much known as a martinet for this. His troops really respected him. He was viewed with a lot of respect, despite the fact that if you break the king's regulations, it's going to be like, oh, the regulations say you should be flogged 300 times, so that's what you're going to get. Because it's that level of not so much force of personality as competence at the job and also being a straight shooter. On the other hand, there are generals like Picton who were like this. Again, going to the higher level here. Sure, they were respected. Nobody liked them. It might be apocryphal, but when Picton is killed at Waterloo, when Picton is killed at Waterloo, the first thing that happens is that a few soldiers who are nearby run to try and loot the corpse. Which is just hilarious, because when Crawford gets wounded, which he'll later die from, soldiers that are nearby run over to see if he's okay. So it's like there's a very complex social norm around crime and punishment going on here. And the simplification of you like flogging, ergo you're probably not a good officer, isn't really it's not reflective of how military society worked at this time. But like Simerson is such a doofus that he could never manage being an effective leader of men in any context, whether he believed in flogging or not. So it almost doesn't matter. It's a historical controversy that's being commented on by the author, but the controversy is almost less of the issue than the fact that the character is just so abysmally stupid.
He is, I mean, ostensibly the villain of the piece, but he's not a competent villain. He's the rube. He's mostly just here to fail and make Sharpe look good.
Yeah, and which Sharpe does repeatedly. Every time Simerson gives him a challenge of, oh, you can't teach the men to shoot well, Sharpe just does it, because Sharpe is apparently so OP that he doesn't have to earn any of his successes. He could just does them and it works. And then later on, it's like, well, you can't get the men who are mutinying to actually return to formation, which again, Sharpe just magically snaps his fingers and does.
Well, because Sharpe is type 2 of the two kinds of officers that exist.
Yeah, pure like leadership 12 automatic reroll bubble.
You can see why I like this analogy.
It's ridiculous. That's why it works. Because it is ridiculous.
It's weird. It's a weird depiction of a upper echelon officer.
Yeah, and like and the thing with this is that it really is just within the adventure fiction framework of you have your villains, you make them as bad as possible, and then watch as the hero just succeeds. It's hard to draw any sort of meaningful historical context or thought out of it, because like you know that it's there because of what genre this is. And it's not there, at least not entirely there, as any sort of statement about anything. It's just, well, he's the villain, so he has to be stupid and bad and evil. Which is a shame, because it would be really interesting if he were, let's go with the phrase that Hogan uses to describe him at the start of the story, his heart's in the right place, he's trying. He wants to be a good soldier. Think of a very different story. You have a fresh colonel who's just bought his commission. He has no military experience outside of the militia. He is determined that he is going to make this the best regiment in the army. He has no idea how to do it. And he doesn't think that the worn down, tired, regular officers that he has, Sharpe, Lennox, untried colonials like Leroy, doesn't think that they are worth listening to. And you have a military drama there, set up for a very different genre, where the arc of the story would not be Simerson is an idiot, watch how Sharpe takes over and does everything right, but you have an officer commanding the regiment who, by the end of the story, learns about the things that he doesn't actually understand and begins to learn how to actually lead from people who know how to. That's a different story, of course, in a totally different genre, but that would be a much more realistic take on the trope, and probably more interesting.
I know we're going to talk about this later, but that's the plot of His Last Command.
It is. Yeah. It's also, it's not the same plot, but it's a similar concept to a Alec Guinness movie from the 1960s called The Tunes of Glory, which is a very, very good military drama about two different regimental commanding officers with completely different worldviews. It goes very different places with it, and it doesn't end well for either character, but it is again, it's a similar concept, and there's a lot of good drama you can pull out of that in a much more grounded way in a different genre. So it kind of feels like a missed opportunity to me, but I wanted something in a different genre than this is. So, you know.
That's the villains.
Yeah.
How about we talk about the rest of the retinue of cardboard cutouts?
Okay. Harper's main personality trait is being Irish.
Yep.
It's kind of weird. Hogan's main personality trait is being friendly.
Yeah. He's the most likable person in the story.
I wish the story was
that
about
is his
him.
only trait. I wish he was a POV character, like for a couple of chapters. In our hypothetical and inexperienced commanding officer sort of learns how the military works and a bit of humility, Hogan's actually a pretty important step along that way, I think.
As would Lennox or Leroy as well.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, like there's potential here for an ensemble cast that isn't really tapped.
I wrote down Lennox, Leroy, and Lawford as good characters.
Yeah.
And I've experienced this story twice. And I'm not going to lie, I don't remember which one's which.
Well, they all start with L, which is kind of weird.
See, I think the last name L is magical and gives you an inherent human decency.
I don't know, it seems like it.
They're the three likable characters in this. Likable. There we go.
Yeah.
That's why.
This is quickly becoming a conspiracy board.
L is for likable. I mean, in all fairness, I've had this problem.
Yeah.
One of my RPGs had 4 different suspects with very similar last names. So.
And you can always remember the RPG we both played in where 3 of 4 player characters, everyone came to the table with some variation of wood as a suffix to the person's name.
Yeah, that was the other one. So,
yeah,
we're not free of this.
Yeah,
we're not free of this in our own storytelling.
Yeah, it's an earworm. It does happen. It's just where the hell were we?
Right.
Oh yeah,
I don't remember which one's which.
Right, yeah. Like, Leroy's the American, Lennox is the only other regular army officer in the regiment, which is why Sharpe likes him.
Right.
Because Sharpe is very cliquish and doesn't trust the militia, which would be an interesting...
And Lawford is Sharpe's old friend from India.
Yeah.
Right, got it. I remember now.
Yeah.
I think the audiobook pronounced it Leroy instead of Leroy, but...
That actually is... Actually, that's probably more historically accurate.
I think it is actually Leroy. That does make more sense. Especially for the American.
Yeah, like, I'm pretty sure that is the accurate American English pronunciation from this period.
Yeah.
Fun fact. Which is that's a neat detail. That's pretty cool. But he so like those 3 are just sort of there, and their primary traits are being regular army, American, and Sharpe's old friend. And that's it.
One of them is also Irish. I'm pretty sure Lennox is Irish.
I think it's Lawford. Lennox is Scott.
Right. There are several various combinations of traits that don't matter. And the fact that I've said these are the best characters in the book and I can't actually remember who they are, that's telling.
It's a problem.
That's a problem.
So do we want to address the massive elephant in the room and talk about how this book uses female characters, or I should say character?
Yeah, let's do that. I think that's really that's one of our last points that we've got, and then we can do the fun part where we just kind of talk about. Well, I've talked a little bit about how we would write this, but let's talk about other media as well.
Yeah. So women. Yeah. So women. I wanna start by. Are you just gonna keep saying that word in different accents?
Women.
So okay, you can stop now. But so I'm gonna bang a drum that I tend to bring up whenever Napoleonic period fiction comes up, which is that despite our own preconceptions about this from the 20th century, military life in the early 19th century and for the entirety of the 18th century and most things before that is not a male-only world. Um, Regiments have camp followers. They have the wives of senior NCOs and also of officers, which also often means children in an era before readily available or accessible birth control. You have, as I say, the camp followers, which are semi-regulated at best, including everything from, off the record family members to tradesmen and tradeswomen to laundresses to the prostitutes thing gets brought up. Those are certainly around, though perhaps less so than the stereotype would lead you to think. So the regiment on campaign or in garrison has a social life. It's a social life that has women in it. They are never just not around. And I think it's kind of a problem that most Napoleonic period fiction, this book included, does very little with this and tends not to bring up women except when, in a case of this story massively failing the Bechdel test, not that that necessarily matters for quality, but has precisely one female character who is purely defined by being attractive and whose only role is to be a love interest.
Which means that it's also failed the sexy lamp test.
Okay, right. Yeah. It's like just because something fails the Bechdel test doesn't mean that it's sexist. But in this case, I'd say this is the kind of failing the Bechdel test that is pretty well actually sexist. So it's like, yeah, she exists. Josephina, right? That is her name.
Yes,
I'm not hallucinating.
Nope, that is correct.
Yeah. So
I don't remember her last name. Don't ask me. She has one. It's her ex-husband's last name that she ran away from.
Yeah. So she exists. She is a character who is around, and as I say, does not really have any personality traits beyond being attractive. Which is not a personality trait. Some personality traits are very attractive, but being attractive is not a personality trait. This is not a two-way street. Sorry, had to throw that in there.
Yeah. I mean, is being a serial cheater a personality trait, or is that just something that makes her unlikable?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know if it's really fair to describe her that way. The backstory at least makes it sound like her husband was cheating on her anyway, so it's like,
yeah,
what?
It's
aristocratic marriages sometimes are like that.
Justifications baked in.
Yeah. And
plot.
yeah, and like, are you a serial cheater if
you cheat on a serial cheater?
Yeah, I know. It's like,
yeah,
I don't know. I think the bigger issue is that she just doesn't have a personality.
Yeah,
to be honest. So she's just sort of there, and yeah, where do you want to go with this? Because I don't have anything off the top of my head about this.
I just hate the subplot. I really do. And I'm actually usually a sucker for romantic subplots. So that should tell you something. I like romantic subplots when they're between characters, which, as we have established, she is not.
It's not the case.
And Sharpe barely is. So it's one of those things where she's clearly exists to make Sharpe behave like an idiot for a couple of chapters.
Yeah.
So she's really only there to drive a conflict, and the conflict is resolved with sexual assault, and then
which is yeah.
The murder is justified because of the sexual assault, but that doesn't make it a good plot.
Yeah,
I'm having a hard time with this one, honestly, because I just really, it's not even necessarily how dare they use women in this way. It's like, it's just not good writing.
Yeah, that's the issue.
It's
And
just bad writing. As I said, it takes up like 50 pages that could have been used on to make any of the other characters more interesting.
yeah, and I tend to agree with that. Just it it's just there, and it's just there.
Yeah,
It's a
I
plot. It's a
mean,
plot device to make the plot happen. And
and then she ditches Sharp for a richer guy and is seen like 5 books later.
oh, really?
Yeah, apparently. I don't know. That's what it said in my research.
Interesting. I have no memory of this.
Apparently, apparently Sharp basically calls her out for leaving him, and she gets really upset. So,
Yeah. Okay.
and makes her look
Well,
bad to her new husband, which may or may not be the one that she left Sharp for. As I said, she gets around. I just don't find that a likable character trait either.
no, it's not. It's it's just a thing. I mean, yeah, and this is the thing with like both that, because that is a thing that you do hear about in the period. Officers, women, if they're not married to them, do have a tendency to float around
Yeah.
sometimes. Sometimes. This is not something that I would say is a generally true thing, but it's a thing that you hear about happening. So it's like, okay, yeah. But, it's like, is anything really interesting done with it? I don't know. Not really. But it's hard to do something interesting if your characters are kind of wooden. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. And then the sexual assault aspect is, yeah, that is a thing that follows every army in this period. We know that it happened to one degree or another. Probably not like this, because this is for bizarre and nonsensical reasons. Not that there's any reason that justifies it, but it's just sort of there. And I guess the issue is not so much that it's not justifiable to include it in the plot,
No, I
but
don't. I don't actually. I think it would actually be a disservice to the historical reality if it wasn't included in some way. It's just that including
not
it,
this way.
not this is not the way to handle that subject matter because it's genuinely horrific.
Yeah, and yeah, it's just it does come off as it comes off as a somewhat insensitive, or perhaps more than somewhat insensitive way of getting us to a point in the plot where we can where we will feel justified for Sharpe to kill his rivals.
Yeah.
Which is like, it's, oh god, this is why it's the issue. This is what I was struggling for. It's the women in refrigerators trope.
Right. Okay.
Just somehow less, somehow worse, because it's
Yeah.
the R word. Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
no, no, just
I mean,
no.
functionally, she's been fridged past that point because she doesn't. This is about 2/3 of the way through the book, and she doesn't reappear until the like final 2 pages.
Yeah,
So functionally, this serves to fridge her without actually doing the dignity of it. You know, uh, making her dead at that point.
yeah. So yeah, I don't like it. It's not that good.
I find it frustrating. It's a really
Yeah,
frustrating point. I think it's fair to say of the genre of this time as well.
yeah,
And as I said, it's not that it's in the book; it's the fact that it's in the book in the way it is.
exactly. Yeah, it's handled very ineptly.
Yeah,
Um, so let's move to the next point here.
yeah,
Because I feel like we've kind of reached the point where we might want to start talking about other media.
yeah. I mean, we can briefly touch on. I think we've touched on um how real or the historiography of the time sort of impacted the book.
Yeah,
I think there was a handful of other comments that I had or things that I observed that I wanted to
sure.
bounce off of you.
Yeah, let's do them rapid fire.
Yeah. The one thing, and I brought it up several times to you, is there's I had a hard time believing that the Spanish army was that incompetent. Of course, the one time they're incompetent, it's a fictional event. But the second time, They basically rout themselves with their own gunfire. They get spooked and basically run away. Um, is there like a kernel of truth in that? Like, were the Spanish this terrible during this time period at actually organizing themselves and morale and discipline and all that?
The short answer is yes and no. Um, the long answer is so the being routed by their own volley is in the historical record as a thing that occurred. So that happened. Now, worth also pointing out that in the same battle, the Spanish troops on the British left actually gave a very good account of themselves. So essentially left of the South Essex's position on the hill in this story.
Yeah.
Or the hill where the South Essex spends the night. Those Spanish troops don't appear in this story. But that may have something to do with the fact that I know Cornwell was using a lot of sources from the early to mid 19th century, like the early histories of the war. And they tend to, the people who wrote them tended to inherit the bias, mostly because they were people who had served. Napier is a good example. They inherited the bias that a lot of British officers went away from trying to work with the Spanish in the Peninsular War, having that the Spanish were totally inept, totally incapable of doing anything, and basically incompetent, and the British won the war for them. It's an equivalent of the America World War II thing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
The difference here is that it is somewhat more justifiable because the Spanish military, to answer your question, at least as far as I can gather from where the historiography is now, was wildly all over the place because of how disorganized the junta was, depending on the region, depending on the regimental commander with the individual regiment, depending on a million different variables. Officers in different parts of Spain could just do whatever, and nobody was really around to stop them. And so you will get units that are like fully composed of people who have just been conscripted with like literally no training and crappy equipment because the officers are embezzling all the money. You will also get regiments that are extremely well managed, very well run, and quite effective, and hate the French with the kind of zealous passion of a sort of born again crusader. And so it's so all over the place. At least that's the impression I get, that in a way the book is unfair. In other ways, the book is kind of fair. And this is like, again, a lot of this scholarship is fairly recent, last 20 or 30 years. So, but you know, it's like, well, the Spanish were definitely capable of the stuff we see in the book. Let's put it that way. That isn't the only story, but I think the sources Cornwell was using are mostly from British officers who really resented the lows and were less willing to acknowledge the high points.
Fair enough.
Because that is kind of what happens when, you know, it's very easy to resent an ally that doesn't want you in your country, thinks of you as Protestant heathens, is very happy to make that opinion known to you, and also doesn't seem to be holding up their end of the bargain about half the time.
Yeah.
You're going to have a pretty hard time acknowledging that the other half of the time they actually do a decent job. It was a very poisoned relationship. I think the way Charles Esdale, who's one of the, I think basically the only English language historian of the Spanish in this period, put it in his history of the Peninsular War, is that the British and the French were enemies but didn't hate each other. The only people that the Spanish hated more than the British were the French.
Yeah.
And then the thing that the British and French could always agree on was that they hated the Spanish. So it's a messy, messy war in a lot of ways, and you know, so yeah, that's my take. The running away from their own volley thing did happen, but the exact circumstances are difficult to ascertain because, of course, they would be.
But it's
Um,
probably reasonable to say that the mass conscripted, poorly trained people who didn't want to be there, that was probably them.
yeah, that was probably them.
Shocking.
And as yeah, and as I say, in other portions of this battle, the Spanish troops performed quite well, or at least commendably. So, it's not a simple picture, and it's a picture that's still getting painted because, again, a lot of the historical research that needs to get done in Spanish needs to find sources that are very hard to find, and there's not a lot even in Spanish language, and a lot of the English language historiography hasn't used those sources. So
Yeah.
this is an ongoing struggle.
I think you can
What?
also, based on what you've described to me, because the Spanish didn't have a solid chain of command or government,
Yeah,
that sort of recording of the war probably just wasn't properly archived and is now lost
no,
to
it's
time. And it's
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. The records are hellishly hard, and like you get to the end of this book, and the end of the book describes the offensive not continuing because the Spanish general working with Wellington, which is Cuesta, screws something up. That's
yeah,
not really what happened. Um, what it is actually is that Cuesta wanted to continue pushing forward. Wellington didn't have the supplies to be able to feed his troops and didn't think he was going to be able to get it from the Spanish, so he was like, we should hang around here. Cuesta was like, okay, then I'm going forward without you, and then runs into a massively superior French force and is forced to retreat. And to make it more complicated, he only runs into that French force because they are not where they should be. Because that French force was supposed to be pinned in a different province by a different Spanish army whose commander decided not to do any of that and to instead besiege a completely insignificant town in the middle of the province rather than actually doing the thing he was told to do.
oh dear. So
So you see what I mean about this getting very complicated.
yeah. Um, actually
It also
bouncing. Oh
actually before we go
yeah,
to
go
the
ahead.
next point, it also doesn't help that Cuesta had been trampled by a horse shortly before this campaign and was in very poor health, as being trampled by a horse will tend to put you in.
Yeah.
So he was not the most communicative with his British allies because he was bedridden for a lot of the campaign.
Oof, ouch, my bones, my everything. It hurts.
Yeah, I just feel bad for the guy.
Yeah, that's really, really unfortunate for him.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask and get your input on basically what Cornwell seems to be blaming the overall failure of this section of the Peninsular War on. So my read on it is he's mostly blaming it on a handful of things. The first is the incompetence of middle echelon British officers, so like Simerson.
Yeah.
Overall political interference from home,
Yeah.
home front inertia, and this idea that every British soldier outside of the riflemen seemed to be relatively brain dead.
Yep.
And I think some of these are probably more valid than others.
Yeah. So he has a weird fixation with the idea that the rifles are elite. Scholars don't agree. Period. The rifles are fine. They're decent troops, but most British troops are pretty decent in this period, so that's not fair. Home front inertia is reasonable. Wellington's army was never as well supplied as he would have liked it to be, and that led to a lot of problems, especially the subsistence problem with food. And also just never getting as many reinforcements as he needed. Political opposition actually it's there, but it's actually not as big of a thing as Cornwell points out. Like the opposition mostly, for the most part, the opposition isn't really hindering Wellington too much. The opposition is usually saying, government, why are we in Spain? Like, how is this helping? We have other priorities, um, which, given the relationship with the Spanish junta, is a reasonable position. Um, so mostly they're on the political level and not really interfering with Wellington's conduct of the campaign. Tarleton's the exception, but after a certain point, nobody listens to him because he keeps saying stupid things like that Wellington shouldn't be attacking. And it's like, hello, we're not in Spain. We're in Portugal. We need to be in Spain. That's the ally we're here to help. Hello. Um, so yeah, I'd say your analysis is right. Some of the things are more fair than others. Um, it's not leagues far from the truth, I think.
Yeah,
And then
I
and
mean,
and then
I
the other thing to add is that he does basically directly blame the Spanish at the end, which is semi-true, but very complicated.
I mean, it feels logically coherent, except for the fact that how the average redcoat is treated.
Yeah.
Everything else does feel at least somewhat reasonable, if although the politics does seem to be overblown for the purposes of this plot, especially.
Yeah. Agreed.
The book is also clearly pretty sympathetic overall to the upper echelons of command. Both generals who appear in this book are treated well by the plot
Yeah.
and are, of course, they're the two major historical figures,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
so they sort of have to be treated with a little bit more respect than a plot device like Simerson and Co. has to be.
Yeah. Though there's always the thing that, like, you look at people who study discipline in the British Army, we want to talk about the whole flogging thing. It's worth pointing out that, Wellington's use of his discretionary justice was always very much based on effect. So it's entirely possible that you could have somebody get arrested one day and have them sentenced to be given 800 lashes for stealing a chicken. Or it could be the next day and they do the same thing and he doesn't press charges.
Mhm.
Because it's all about effect. What unit are they from? Do they have morale problems? All of that stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
it's more about sending a message, not even
which
to
is,
the individual bloke, like
yeah,
to the people around them. It's not really for the individual; it's for the
yeah,
greater whole.
yeah. And like the fact that Wellington, these aspects of his command personality, I don't think really get brought up at any point in the books. But he is the great British hero of the period, other than Nelson. So, as your point leads perfectly to that, yeah, that's not going to be really analyzed in any depth. Um, but yeah, so I'd agree with that. What's next?
Well, just the lack of presence of the French in general.
Yeah,
That sort of lack of emphasis is placed on the French army. Though in general, my impression of them is that they were usually overall very effective with decent leadership.
yeah,
And there's this weird bit in the Battle of Talavera where they're talking about, oh, only their outer ranks even know how to shoot a gun. And I'm like,
yeah.
that's a weird line. Is that right?
It's not true.
Yeah, I was like,
So
that doesn't seem.
this is something Cornwell gets from the early histories. And actually, especially this is a thing that has been a big part of a lot of the historiography for like forever. I don't know when this changed, but in the 80s or 90s. So again, Cornwell wouldn't really have access to this. There is this sort of weird tactical debate within the scholarship where there is this traditional impression that the French always attacked in column, focusing on the use of the bayonet, not shooting to force through their attacks. So you have the massive grand battery artillery preparatory barrage. The infantry go in. They use the attack column in their elan to force the enemy to retreat at the point of the bayonet. That is a very simplistic view of French tactics. In reality, they are as adaptive as everyone else's. Yes, their soldiers know how to shoot. That's not a thing. Plenty of French troops throughout the Napoleonic Wars do what the British do: deploy into line, throw a few volleys at them, ram them home with the bayonet. That's pretty standard. They do sometimes attack an attack column. They sometimes do other things. They're a very flexible army. Um, so that all is there. But there is this impression in the English language scholarship that that's not the case. And part of the issue Whether they were in column or not all the time is debated, but part of the issue is that in the peninsula specifically, as opposed to the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, there is this bizarre tendency whenever the French armies meet the British for them to immediately attack. Artillery, immediate bayonet attack. And it's very weird. It's not a tendency you get elsewhere. Like, they can do it, but it's not the only thing they do. But against the British, it's the only thing they do most of the time, and it always fails. It's bizarre.
That's weird.
Yeah, and the scholarship has been trying to figure out why the hell the French kept doing things that were clearly not working every time they fought the British in Spain. And I don't think there's an answer now. There are theories, but there's no good answer.
I mean, is it something to do with maybe they don't actually have their best commanders in Spain at this time, or
that's part of it?
That's probably part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, because of course Napoleon has the entirety of Europe to worry about, and the overall commanders that he sends to Spain are usually not that good.
Well, and actually, I think that kind of gets called out in the book, that they say, I don't remember who it is specifically, but they say, like, we're seeing now they're sending more competent people into Spain. And I think that's probably another reason why this British campaign does eventually start to fall apart, probably because they start committing better quality commanders and troops to this front.
Yeah, possibly. I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, but this is a tactical thing that you keep seeing in a lot of battles, and it's very weird. And we're still trying to figure out why. The one theory that I like, which might explain it, is that often these battles happen after very, very long periods of forced marching to intercept the British army. So the French have forced marched from like very widely distributed garrisons in Spain, which is a huge, very arid country where it's difficult to forage in. And the French army lives off of foraging off of the local population. They do not have they don't even have the sort of poor quality supply train for food that the British have. They rely on being able to live off the land. And one of the theories I've heard is that in most of these campaigns, these battles happen after a long period of forced marching through this sort of like very food poor terrain where they can't forage. So the theory is that when the French commanders give battle in a lot of these battles with the British in Spain, they are mostly concerned with, okay, we need to win the battle immediately and get going somewhere where we can get food, because we do not think that our troops are well fed or well rested enough to actually withstand a sustained battle. So preparatory barrage, immediately go in, try to break them immediately, and do not get bogged down in a static battle that'll take us most of a day or even 2 days. That's a theory, but it sounds like it might have some truth to it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a reasonable argument.
Yeah, and it would at least explain it rather than just, it would explain it in a way that does make some degree of sense, rather than them just like continually throwing their head at a wall and just hurting themselves repeatedly for no apparent reason.
They're not just all blood for the blood god.
Yeah, they're not trying to martyr themselves.
Yeah.
But it is a continuing problem where it's like, guys, why are you doing the same thing over and over again and just not learning from it? And yeah, the historiography is still trying to figure out why. It's a bizarre thing. And it's so non-reflective of like how the French army is everywhere else in this period.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that answers my 3 kind of core historical questions that came up. And I think those were really satisfying answers. So, unless there's any other commentary you'd like to make.
No.
And honestly, it doesn't sound like Cornwell was wildly off of these.
No.
Apart from a few weird things that actually couldn't have been helped based on what he would have read and what he would have known from the time.
Yeah, like we can't blame him for not having access to books written 20 years after he wrote this. That's stupid.
It's reasonable. We have to give him, as historians, the that benefit of the doubt that there's just certain things in this book that just weren't realistic for him to have put in because we hadn't thought about them that way yet.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Spanish are a big example of that because the literature on them was almost non-existent in English until the 1990s.
Yeah.
In many ways, it's still almost non-existent. There are just like 3 or 4 books, which is nothing.
So how about we take the last 10 minutes or so of this episode and talk a little bit about, well, I think we've been calling this the rewriting room.
Yeah,
We talked a little bit about what we would have done differently in the story, but
and I think most of that stands. So let's lump this in here and ask ourselves, of the let's just say related works that we've been reading recently, not on the podcast.
Might get around to them.
Yeah, what do we think should have been done differently, and what else has done those things differently? Because I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about serial fiction, and I want to talk about in ensemble casts. Because the Sharpe novels are a long on-running series with sort of sweeping story arcs, and B, they've got a lot of characters, but at the same time, they don't have a lot of characters.
Mm-hmm.
The characters don't have that much character,
Yeah.
which is a problem. Even the main character doesn't have a lot of character. We talked a little bit about kind of that lack of character development that doesn't seem to go on through this series, and is one of the main reasons why it's easy to lose interest in this story. So let's talk a bit about Gaunt's Ghost, and actually the work of Dan Abnett in general, because we're both fans of certain parts of Warhammer 40k. And Greg, you actually introduced me to Gaunt's Ghosts about a year ago now, and I binged the entire series in about a month on audiobook. And I really liked it. And the reason I think we wanted to talk about this format of story is that they're pretty analogous in the sense that most of the books in these series are both around 300 pages. They're not long books, but they pack a lot in. About 300 pages per volume, and are military adventure stories at their core. What Gaunt's Ghost does is that it focuses on a regiment. The main character, I guess you could almost say, isn't really any individual member of this focus regiment, which is the Tanith first and only. It's really the regiment itself is sort of the main character of the books. And who exactly the main character of any individual novel is can actually change quite a bit. And individual characters get their own focus arcs and develop from story to story. So, do you want to expand a bit on that, or shall I keep going?
You should keep going because you've read these much more recently than I have. I'll interject when it's appropriate.
Yeah. So Gaunt's Ghost, if Gaunt's Ghost does have an ostensible main character, it's Ibram Gaunt, the titular character. Though, again, Gaunt's Ghosts refers to the Tanith first and only. So really, there's two main characters of this series. And Gaunt is really only the focus character when he needs to be.
Yeah, I feel like he gets focused like maybe 1/5 of the time in each book, and the other 4/5 are other people.
Yeah.
On average, there are exceptions.
He's usually the most important decision maker in a given plot. If he's not butting heads with the whatever the antagonist is of any given series. And I think actually that's maybe one of the weaker parts of the early series, is that the early villains of Gaunt's Ghost do actually have a fair bit in common with Simerson.
Yeah, which actually gets much better once those higher level officers start getting more competent and their differences of opinion with Gaunt start becoming more on questions of principle or practicality rather than just being stupid.
Yeah. Gaunt also has certain things in common with Sharpe. He does tend to hit things with his sword quite a bit because he has a very cool sword.
Yeah.
Um, there's he leads from the front, but he's also inspiring to his men. He's definitely more of the type to lead by example and overall aura. But we also see him developing closer bonds with his men and relationships and making sure that they function as a fighting unit overall. In general, there's a
Yeah.
lot more attention put on the Tanith as a fighting unit in their own right, even aside from Gaunt. Each of the other major deuteragonists of the story has their own sort of specialties and personality quirks, personality flaws. They're allowed to fail and mess up. Gaunt's allowed to fail and mess up.
In other words,
Um,
they all have three-dimensional personalities, even when they're, the amount of development they get each book might only be like part of a chapter or maybe 3 or 4 pages. Over time, that stuff is allowed to accumulate, and you end up with very well fleshed out characters, even if their total screen time for each individual one isn't that much.
and aside from just Gaunt's Ghost, though Gaunt's Ghost does also do this, um, Gaunt's Ghost isn't really episodic in the same way that Sharpe is, in the sense that usually the actual overall story arcs of Gaunt's Ghost can be usually divided into either into some sort of trilogy or duology, and sometimes so they're multi-book story arcs, but there's but you can say, okay, I want to read this specific story arc of Gaunt's Ghost, and you can say, okay, it's these 3 books, and some of them
Yeah.
are better than others. Some of them are really good. Um,
Only in
and
Death, baby. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, my favorites are probably Necropolis, Sabbat Martyr, Only in Death, and I want to say Straight Silver is also quite good.
I love Straight Silver. Straight Silver is a damn good book.
That
Space World War One
entire
will get me every time.
that entire that's a 4 book series. Honor Guard, Guns of Tannis, Straight Silver, and Sabbat Martyr are all one kind of long story. It's semi episodic, but it is an arc. And that's what I really like about that format. Now, I do think that the later Sharpe books can be loosely organized into that kind of format where you're looking at specific campaigns and battles, but I don't think it's quite as intentional, and that really lets it
And
down.
yeah, and like that was my experience. They did sort of blend together, and I think the reality was that it never really felt like, again, the character from my memory never really felt like the character work developed because with Gaunt's Ghosts, the thing that's developing in those arcs is the character stuff.
Yeah,
The actual
the
mission, the campaign, what they're doing in each book is different, but the character stuff is what develops and gets carried over.
yeah,
Whereas with the later Sharpe books, it's like Sharpe's situation might change. You get like the getting married arcs and those things, but they're more situational. It's not like the character's interiority really changes because it's not really what these books are about. Whereas with Gaunt's Ghosts, it's like, yeah, these characters do have interiority, and it changes despite being a pulpy military sci-fi series based on a board game.
yeah. And I mean, I've called this out before. I mentioned it earlier in the episode that I'm a big fan of light novels, and light novels generally do the big thing. So, for those who don't uh, understand the term, light novels are a style of book coming out of Japan. They usually get adapted into anime or manga, but they follow a similar tend to some. follow a similar format where you will get individual arcs with focus characters from a broader cast that will basically set up an individual situation, mission, conflict, but that escalation of character development and of character growth is utilized to kind of tie the stories together. And that's a really powerful tool for serial fiction when it's done correctly, where you can have an episodic tone and come up with wildly different individual scenarios, where you can do, high octane combat drops where you've got, 50 landing craft all coming in at once, and some of them are getting shot down, and then their landing gets scrambled, and the squad has to come back together. And then the next book is like World War I, trench warfare, and then back to Gaunt's Ghosts. And then the next one might be having to guard the remains of a saint as they're trying to, or a saint herself as they're trying to keep her safe in the middle of an urban war zone. And that happens within 3 books.
Yeah,
And
it's like, what interesting thing do we want to do now? And then it's like, how do we tie the character arcs that we've been working with into that?
And
And
it's something that could be really interesting for Sharpe to do, because they've got a lot of really good options for focus characters. I think just in this book, I called out Ensign Denny, Hogan, and Lennox are all characters who get a lot of screen time, but don't necessarily get a lot of development.
yeah, and if Cornwell had like focused more on developing them and giving them some of the spotlight, then he'd probably be in a good place going forward to do something with that, but it never really happens.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
because that you can even start a character arc and then carry it through to the next book. And Denny dies at the end of this one, which I think if he had been a focus character, could have been effective, but it also could have been effective to let him grow up a bit and then kill
yeah.
him off if that needed to happen, and that would have actually had some. I didn't care when Denny died. I was like, all right,
Yeah,
okay,
I mean, this is what you get when you don't really have fully fleshed out characters. They don't feel
yeah,
like they have an internal life. And like, I, and again, it's an unfair comparison, but those sections I was reading from Tolstoy, the section of Prince Andrew's regiment being under artillery fire, I felt more about these random nameless Russian conscripts dying than I did about Denny dying or I did about Lennox dying.
yeah. It just doesn't have
Interesting.
it just doesn't have any weight or resonance. And I
Yeah.
mean, the Gaunt's Ghost will punch you in the gut, and you'll make you hurt when some of these
Yeah.
characters die, and there'll be
Yeah. That's
some
what actual development will
genuine
do. Yeah.
emotional resonance. And this actually applies pretty well to a lot of Dan Abnett's writing. I've been
Yeah.
listening through the Horus Heresy series, and the first couple of books that he wrote, that sort of the way he sets up Horus and the Lunar Wolves as this sort of almost band of brothers type relationship, where they're really tightly knit, and the circumstances that draw the Lunar Wolves into becoming the sons of Horus and later rebelling against the Emperor
Yeah.
are
I mean,
really, really compelling, and Dan Abnett's really good at this.
yeah, and it's like I do think that to write good military fiction, whether sci-fi or historical, you have to have a good focus on character, and you
Yeah,
have to be able to write characters that are like you can really they have interiority. You can do that without spending a huge amount of time because you also have, all the job that they're doing to focus on. Um, you have to be able to build that connection to really sustain good long-term character work and good long-term story interest because ultimately um, what's going to carry on across the novels is the unit,
Yeah, I I
not
n- I
not the
I,
mission.
I name checked Band of Brothers, but Band of
Yeah,
Brothers the show is also like this, where it's semi
yeah,
episodic but maintains character development
yeah,
through, even if individual characters come to the end of their arcs and die. Um,
and like it's much like what we've been talking about, very lightly sketched character work, where it's like you don't get a lot of time with individual characters, or rather, the time is spread across a great many. But the time that you do get with them is spent very well and used very well to sort of give you a sense of who they are, um, and you care, and that's just an important thing to really hit home if you actually want to. And this is adventure fiction, so like Sharpe is not going for this. Like it is to some degree a power fantasy. Um, but if you want to get into characters dying and the experience of actual war, and you want to get towards the old, I can't remember who came up with it, but the old quote that in war you will die like a dog for no good reason. Um, Sometimes, you want to get into that. You want to deal with that stuff. You want to deal with the reality. You have to be able to do character work like this. And, you know, it doesn't have the impact if you're in a cynical 90s anti-hero power fantasy world where you just run and hit things with a sword. Um, which is a little harsh and it sounds harsh, but I think it's also kind of true and kind of why, to be honest, this kind of fell flat for me in a number of ways. Did I
yeah,
enjoy reading it? Yeah, but was it underwhelming? Yeah.
I think that's a really good place to kind of start to wrap things up, because my final impression is that I enjoyed it for what it was. It's good for its genre. The issue that is that it's being written in a genre that A, I don't think works all that well for historical fiction, and B, I just don't enjoy all that much, because I think that one of the things we're going to come back to time and again with this podcast, and just what we prioritize or really value with historical fiction and fiction in general, is good character work. It's being able to understand the interiority of people, of and that's a big issue even with historical education, is just recognizing the people of the past as people, and
Especially
not,
when they're different from you.
especially when they're different, especially when they've got different life ways and experiences and ways of viewing the world. I think historical fiction can be a really good way to express that, but we're
As
sort
can,
of,
as can speculative stuff like fantasy or science fiction when it's approached in that way as well, which is something we'll get into.
and so this is a really good baseline for discussing historical fiction going forward, because it's not really what a not to do, but something that can be built upon and can be better understood. So when we check this and call back to it, um, you can understand kind of where we're coming from when we're talking about, oh, we want to treat our characters as agents with their own sort of interior lives and motivations, and then that has to interact with the overall historical context in some way. And I just don't see that coming out here, which is too bad.
Which is a shame because like there's good raw material here for a much more interesting like military drama story. But again, it's like, you know, A, first novel, B, not the genre that I'm talking about.
And
Different
constrained
genre. Yeah.
and constrained by its own historiography.
True. Yeah, that as well. And
And that's actually something that we'll be calling back to, because we're both practicing historians. We can kind of empathize with that kind of perspective of, there's only so much we can do with the data
yeah,
we have access to, but at the same time, there's certainly things that could have been done that are let down more by genre.
yeah. And and that's just something that we'll be interrogating a lot as we go forward because, you know, genre affects a lot, especially if you're writing something or creating something with a conscious desire to make it marketable. People who work in the publishing industry can attest to this. Like, there is a checklist for whatever genre you're writing in of stuff that the marketers and the publishing people want the book to be, and they want it to tick those boxes. They don't want it to do weird, radical, very different things. They want it to fit a certain idea of what that genre should be like. Which doesn't mean that those weird, radical experiments don't get published, but it means that publishing them is harder than it needs to be. And authors get directed towards, you want it to sell, do these things. Whether that's accurate or not. Worth pointing out that the second best-selling thing in the 20th century next to the Bible was The Lord of the Rings, which is kind of the exact opposite of these things and actively thumbs its nose at basically all genre conventions.
We'll get there in a couple of episodes. And honestly, that this idea of what's different kind of priorities going to media, that's going to come up again a couple of times. Actually, our very next episode, we're gonna go into something that we're both really interested in, which is video games. And we'll talk a little bit about player agency, design, and how to weave historical context and texture into a game while still making it something very unique. We're going to be talking about Pathologic 2, and I'm very excited.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to that for a while.
So that's our next project. Both of us, this episode has very much been in Greg's corner, his historical interests, and I've been really interested to hear his input. I've actually really learned a lot about and been able to sort of test some of my own theories and ideas along the way about this period, and it's been really fun. But next week, I've really enjoyed this, and it's been enlightening. I think this will be. I really hope our listeners found this as interesting as I did, because well done.
You'll have to share more about where that's coming from after we're off mic, but I'll let you finish first.
It's really those answers to my last three questions that I thought were really good.
Well, thank you.
And those were the three that I came up with while reading the book, and you were able to answer them really satisfactorily. So there you go. So I think that's it. I think thank you all who are listening for listening to this episode. Our next one, I hope, will come out in early January. This should be pretty quick to edit and post. And then we'll start writing the script and brainstorming ideas for the next one. Pathologic 2's one of both of our absolute favorite video games of all time. I wrote a large section of my master's thesis on Pathologic 2. And Greg, you're playing through it right now, I think.
Yeah. Let's just put it this way. I am a big fan for Eastern European high art, and admittedly I managed to shoehorn that into the discussion today, but Pathologic 2 will be our first real deep dive into that, and
it's
oh
good
boy.
It's good timing too, because the sequel to that, Pathologic 3, is coming out fairly soon.
Yeah.
So we've been Noah
and Greg.
And we'll sign out here. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, we'll be trying to do more of these. So do the usual YouTube pleasantries. Subscribe, give us a like, and ring the bell icon so you know when the next episode of Storiography is coming out.
Yeah, because our schedule is a bit much, so...
A bit much. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, have a nice night.
Cheerio.